Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Before I get into today's video, you may have seen my post about this. A lot of people have been asking, where are your oversimplified reactions? A few of them are still there. Most of them are currently private. AdRev, who is the organization that represents a lot of YouTube channels in terms of detecting content being used by other channels, has filed copyright strikes and takedown notifications on some of my oversimplified videos. I have appealed, lost the appeals, and now I'm waiting for YouTube to do a final review before taking down the videos. So far, 2 of them have copyright strikes and takedown notices. If I get a third one and YouTube upholds the ruling on that, they will shut my channel down. So I've preemptively privatized most of the rest of them while I figure all this out. I doubt the oversimplified people are even aware that any of this is happening. It's all being done by management on their behalf. But that's what's going on. Stay tuned. In the meantime, the link in the description to my other channels, please subscribe to those, because if for some reason Vlogging Through History does get taken down and I have to restart the channel, those will be the best places where you can stay up to date with what's going on while I get things going again. So we'll see what happens. In the meantime, we're going to keep pressing ahead. And you've often heard me talk about how James Garfield is one of those what ifs for me in history, that I think potentially he could have been one of our greatest presidents, and super intelligent guy, had a lot going for him, and assassinated very early in his term. So we're going to take a look at biographics, our friend Simon Whistler, today, and see what they have to say about James Garfield, the what-if president. As always, the link is in the description to the original content. Highly encourage you to support the original content creators. Let's go ahead and dive in.
This episode of the show is brought to you by Squarespace, the tool to use to make a website for your business, for your brand. More about them in a bit. Here's the greatest president we never had. It's the sort of opening line you can imagine using for a number of figures. For those in American history who narrowly lost elections or simply never gained their party's nomination. A lament for those who should have been in the White House but never quite got there. But that's not the sort of person today's video is about. Rather, we're using the greatest president we never had to describe someone who literally did become president.
Yeah,
James
briefly.
A. Garfield was elected in 1880 in one of the tightest campaigns ever fought. On entering the White House the following spring, he became the 20th US president. Yet America never got to see what it'd be like in office. Just 100 days into his term, Garfield was shot while waiting for a train. Although he held on for a couple of months, an infection in the wound eventually spelled his doom. And that's a great shame, because the potential was there for Garfield to become a spectacular president.
Yeah, 100% agree with that, and I love seeing other people starting to say the same thing. You know, everyone knows I've got a very strong Ohio bias, being an Ohioan, especially being a Northeast Ohioan. My fellow Northeast Ohio presidents, William McKinley, James Garfield, Grant has strong ties here. Nixon has ties to Northeast Ohio. But Garfield was, he's in that string of post-American Civil War presidents. There's that 50-year stretch or so where basically your best chance to become president was to be born in Ohio and be a Civil War veteran and be a Republican. And Garfield checked all those boxes, right? Grant, born in Ohio, Civil War general, Republican. You've got Benjamin Harrison, born in Ohio, Civil War general, Republican. James Garfield, born in Ohio, Civil War general, Republican. Rutherford B. Hayes, all of those things as well. William McKinley was not a general, but was still born in Ohio, Civil War veteran. Garfield, though, has the distinction of being one of the only guys who ran against a Democrat nominee for president who was also a Civil War general veteran. In fact, he might have been, I'm trying to think, I can't think of another Democrat who led troops in the field as a general who was a nominee for president. Winfield Scott Hancock's the only guy, and that's Garfield versus Hancock. It was a tight election, very close. One wonders what might have happened if Garfield had lost and Hancock had won, and then Garfield had run later, because Garfield was a young guy, but maybe I'm getting ahead of myself.
A deeply moral man who'd grown up in poverty, Garfield was a champion of civil rights and determined to reform a corrupt system. That he died before doing so may be one of America's greatest forgotten tragedies.
You can always recognize pictures of Garfield because he's got those piercing blue eyes in those pictures. You can see it there. That's years before he had his beard. Handsome dude, got that chiseled, wide jaw going on there, and was super intelligent. College president, I think our only ordained minister who's been president.
One of the weirdest aspects of modern politics is watching multimillionaires try to prove their working-class credentials, to claim a background of adversity, even while sitting on a stock portfolio most of us could only ever dream of. James A. Garfield would have laughed at people like that. Unlike today's posers, the 20th president really did grow up in biting poverty. Born on the Ohio frontier on November the 19th, 1831, Garfield has the distinction of being the last president born in a log cabin.
Yep.
But while the reality of life in early America meant that you could be born in a little cabin while still making it big, the only thing big about Garfield's early life was the staggering adversity. His father, a stout farmer and amateur wrestler, died when the boy was only 1, leaving Garfield's mother penniless. To give you just some idea of how poor the family was, they couldn't afford shoes for the boy until he was 4.
And you have to remember the times here, okay? Garfield's 1 year old, so 1832, okay? Ohio's been a state for 15 years. It really still kind of is on the frontier, the western frontier of the more populated parts of the United States. And this is a time when women don't have a lot of legal rights. And so basically his mom's options were rely on relatives or get remarried as quickly as possible.
As a result of this upbringing, the 20th president would spend his life with what seems like a massive case of imposter syndrome, a feeling that he somehow didn't deserve to be among the gilded elite of Washington. Which is all sorts of strange when you think about it, as Garfield's life was basically the American dream made real. Poor he may have been, but the boy was also exceptionally bright, far more capable and intelligent than anyone else in their corner of the world.
Yeah, that's the other thing you have to remember, okay? This is a time when not everyone is getting education. These days everyone at least is going, for the most part, going to school up until high school here in the United States, but that wasn't always the case. My great grandparents didn't go past 2nd or 3rd grade, a lot of them. It just wasn't that uncommon. So for a guy to be super intelligent on the frontier and get that good education, get a college education, that really did kind of raise him to the top of kind of the cream of the crop, the elite among people in Northeast Ohio at that time.
And people will recognize this. His mother scrimped and saved to try and find money to send him to school. His older brother went out to work at 11 just to help raise the $17 they needed for Garfield's education. Not that the boy initially wanted to study. Having grown into a big burly lad with powerful arms just like his old dad, the teenage boy was convinced his future lay in a life of adventure as a sailor, not in being a boring old bookworm. Age 16, he ran away, hightailing it to the Erie Canal to work on the boats.
The Erie Canal. It's E-R-I-E. There's not 2 E's at the beginning of the Erie Canal, just so we're clear.
And experience adventure. What he got instead was a big, great dollop of humility. Unable to swim, Garfield was almost comically unsuited to canal work. By his own admission, he fell in the water and had to be rescued 14 times in 6 weeks.
Wow.
On top of that, he contracted malaria and eventually wound up being sent home to recover. And with that lesson learned, the boy sheepishly returned to education.
So, interesting. I didn't know some of this. I mean, I only know mostly about his life from the Civil War onward. And then his life in politics after the war, or during the war, and then into after the war. But, this doesn't surprise me. Adversity creates character in people, and it leads to perseverance, and it leads to that attitude of being an overcomer. And a lot of the times, the people who rise to the top in politics are the people who deal well with that adversity and can take the knocks and keep on going and overcome. And Garfield certainly appears to be one of those people.
It would be the smartest movie ever made. Although he had the build of Popeye's nemesis Bluto, Garfield's mind was like a storehouse for knowledge. He could absorb books like a nerdy sponge, and had soon mastered mathematics and ancient languages, as well as gaining a respectable grounding in literature and history. Of course, he still had to work to supplement his mother's meager savings. First as a carpenter, then as a janitor, the boy worked himself ragged to get through school, to get the education that could change his life. This is the American dream part of the tale, the part where Garfield works his arse off and through sheer grit and intelligence alone goes in 2 years from working as the school's janitor to being one of its professors. Perhaps most impressively, he did all of this while keeping an optimistic outlook. As a young man, Garfield was one of those people you're always happy to see. The kind of guy who'll give you a bear hug, buy you a drink, tell you a dirty joke, and then leave you crying with laughter. He hunted, he drank, he chased the ladies, at one point keeping 3 women on the go at once. Yes, there was also a deeper side.
I'm getting some real Theodore Roosevelt vibes here. The difference, I think, maybe between the two is maybe Roosevelt faced more adversity, but Garfield probably had more intelligence going for him.
To him, one that brought students flocking to his lectures, that saw him trained to become a Christian minister. That saw this extroverted young man at last turn to the career that would make his name: politics. This was the mid-1850s, when slavery was the issue of the day, and a radical new party had just formed to oppose its expansion. Known as the Republican Party, it would draw in James Garfield, giving him a way to express his anti-slavery beliefs, giving him support when he ran for the Ohio legislature, becoming the state's youngest lawmaker. But it was also the Republican Party that would soon draw Garfield into the biggest test of his life: war.
So the Civil War is really fascinating in that it kind of was this two-way street between military and politics. A lot of guys got their military position because of politics. Think of someone like Dan Sickles, who's a congressman, who uses his wealth but also his political power to get himself an appointment that eventually allows him to rise to major general in command of a corps. And you have a lot of political generals like that. And even people who had military educations, sometimes it was their political connections that got them up the ladder quicker, like Irwin McDowell, for example. Irvin McDowell, I don't know why I call him Irwin. Irvin McDowell got the command of the army in the field that led to the First Battle of Bull Run, in part because he had political connections other people didn't have. And a lot of times that helped. But it also worked the other way. A lot of guys turned success in the military into a successful post-war political career. And Garfield kind of starts in politics, goes to the military, and then bounces back into politics again. It's pretty fascinating. I love that Ohio flag.
You can see the effect the febrile atmosphere of the late 1850s was having on Garfield from his correspondence, that how increasingly firm his anti-slavery beliefs became. When he attended an anti-slavery lecture as a younger man, he merely noted, "The darky had some funny remarks, and witty too." By 1860, though, he felt comfortable writing, "I'm inclined to believe that the sin of slavery is one of which it may be said that without the shedding of blood there is no remission."
So that is a quote from the Bible, that without the shedding of blood there is no remission of sin. It's the whole idea on which the idea of Jesus dying on the cross, shedding his blood for the sin of the world, that's kind of where a lot of that is a response to that. And a lot of people had this attitude, and you hear Lincoln allude to that in his second inaugural address, where he talks about how if it means that all of the blood that was shed by the bondsmen's however many years of unrequited toil, every drop of blood that was drawn with the lash, in other words, through slavery, then had to be drawn with the sword. In other words, a lot of people viewed the Civil War as America atoning for the sin of slavery by people having to die to rectify that situation. And so you can see his Christian worldview in this, and you would probably consider Garfield to be one of the radical Republicans. In other words, a lot of Republicans like Abraham Lincoln, for example, were against the spread of slavery to new territories, but weren't strictly abolitionists. The radical Republicans were the ones who want abolition. They want full citizenship and full equality under the law for the newly freed slaves.
which is a clunky 19th century way of saying that the future president was more than happy to settle the issue in battle. We know this because when war broke out in April of 1861, Garfield was among those cheering loudest, not because he supported the Confederacy, but because the North finally had an excuse to head south and smash up the slave system. That year, 1861, Garfield began recruiting for the regiment that he'd soon lead, the 42nd Ohio Volunteers. It was an easy task. The future president was still lecturing at this point, and swaths of his students signed up to serve under him, driven as much by personal loyalty as by their desire to punish Dixie. Although he was a natural fighter, Garfield was also keenly aware that the fate of these men rested on him. During training, he'd blow through entire nights, determinedly reading up on military tactics.
Reminds me a lot of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain there, a guy who doesn't have a military background, but is an academic, is super smart, and wants to be the best. And so you can see that drive in Garfield. He wants to be, he's been put in this position of authority over a lot of men, doesn't have the West Point education, but he is going to pour through those books, those manuals, and learn how to be the best general he can.
In this way, he was not dissimilar to another president we recently covered, Benjamin Harrison, who was also a bookish and brave soldier and also born in Ohio. But while Harrison would approach war somberly and with a feeling of heavy duty, James Garfield approached it like a bat out of hell. His first significant action was at the Battle of Middle Creek in January 1862. There he managed to direct his forces in such a way that the much larger Confederate grouping thought they were being attacked by multiple regiments and went into retreat. A stunning victory pulled off with limited resources. In fact, it was so stunning that it left Garfield in charge of the whole of eastern Kentucky. As somebody whose roots are in eastern Kentucky, here you go. I've now mentioned Northeast Ohio and my ancestors. I had several ancestors who fought under Garfield in those battles in eastern Kentucky. Actually, I also had ancestors who were fighting against Garfield in some of those battles. So just one more reason why I absolutely love this guy. By March, it chased the Confederates out of the rest of the state. So impressive was this win that he was made brigadier general. That summer, while Garfield was on leave with dysentery, his friends sought to capitalize on this by putting his name forward for election to the House of Representatives. He won without doing any campaigning. But since he wasn't required to report to Washington for a whole year, Garfield went straight back to the South for another round of war. This time, though, he'd witness an embarrassing Union defeat. The Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863 was the sort of hapless omni-disaster usually associated with the modern UK Conservative Party. Only instead of crashing the economy, it featured Union troops getting their asses handed to them. Yet, even amid this utter show, Garfield managed to come out smelling like roses. One of the only senior officers to return to the field after the retreat began, Garfield made a daring ride under enemy fire to help General Thomas's defense.
We're going to cover Chickamauga more because I definitely have plans to get back down to the Chickamauga battlefield and do a whole series there. This was a battle more than most that was decided more by the generals in the field than it was by the men fighting. It was decision making that would make or break that battle. And it was an absolute debacle and an embarrassment. Where you have the Army commander, Rosecrans, you have a couple of the Corps commanders, all just basically leaving the field during the beginning of the retreat and heading back to Chattanooga. And you have George Thomas and guys like Garfield who are the ones who stay and fight. And that's why Thomas is called the Rock of Chickamauga. And that's why he was the only one of those senior commanders who was left standing after that battle when Grant came in, basically cleaned house.
Although this didn't turn the tide of battle, it was enough to get him promoted to Major General, the youngest man in the Union Army to hold such a rank. It was also the end of Garfield's military career. With the deadline to take his seat in the House now looming, the young man was convinced to permanently leave the battlefields.
And this is why you don't hear more about Garfield's involvement in the war. Is number one, because he spent so much of the early war in eastern Kentucky where there weren't big battles happening, a lot of small skirmishes, a lot of fighting, but nothing real major. And then once you have his involvement in some of the bigger battles like Chickamauga, well, now he's going to go take his seat in Congress.
And honestly, it may have saved his soul. In Washington, Garfield would admit to friends that war had shaken him badly. As one later wrote, something went out of him that never came back. The sense of the sacredness of life and the impossibility of destroying it. Yet this glimpse of brutality would ignite a new fire inside the man, a desire not just to see the Union win the war, but to win the peace as well. To watch James A. Garfield's career from war to the end of Reconstruction is to watch a radical star slowly lose his fire and dim into a chilly pragmatist. When he first entered the House, Garfield was perhaps the most radical member, arguing for the seizure of Southern property, for the execution of Confederates, for the South to be beaten to its knees.
Yeah, and this was the debate that was happening, right? You have factions within the Republican Party. The Republicans have all the power at this point. There's factions that are more pragmatic. There are the ones who want to, like Lincoln, who want to restore the South to its full status as a part of the Union, who want to basically turn their back on punishing folks like Jefferson Davis. And there's the quote in the movie Lincoln where Lincoln basically tells Grant, he says, if Jefferson Davis and those guys, if they just escape the country while my back's turned, that's not going to bother me any. There were a few hangings, but they weren't for rebellion or treason. They were for specific war crimes. It was Henry Wirz who commanded Andersonville, and then there was a Confederate officer who was responsible for a massacre of black troops in Saltville, Virginia, among other things. And but there were people like Garfield, and there were others just like him who wanted to really come down hard on the South. And honestly, in hindsight, you could make a strong argument that maybe they were right. I don't know.
So long as slavery was around, he wouldn't rest. He wouldn't cool off. As he wrote in his diary, slavery be damned. Yet, for all the fire he directed towards the South's peculiar institution, Garfield was no John Brown. In fact, his radicalism seems to have masked a deeply conflicting set of racial views. As 1865 saw the Confederacy limp towards defeat, the future president began openly supporting black suffrage. At the same time, though, he was privately writing to a friend, "It goes against the grain of my feelings to favour Negro suffrage, for I never could fall in love with the creatures." From our vantage point, this seems a little screwy, but then those were the times in which
those would have been the more mainstream of views. Today we see that and it's abhorrent. It's how could you view your fellow human beings that way? But this was an evolving process. Most people did not start out as abolitionists who viewed black people as equals in every way. A lot of people had to be dragged into that viewpoint. A lot of, even the Abraham Lincolns Lincoln never thought it was going to be possible for blacks and whites to live equally in the United States. And so he advocated very strongly for resettlement of freed slaves to Central America, to Liberia, places where he felt they could maybe have a better chance. And so this is not an unusual view. That's not to say there weren't people who felt completely okay with equality that would have seen things the way we do today. It was pretty unusual at the time.
Virtually all white people, even those who were anti-slavery, had been brought up to consider black folk inferior.
True.
And while Garfield may have privately harboured un-PC views, his actions almost always supported equality. That meant voting for the Civil Rights Act of 1866, for the Reconstruction Amendments, for the Ku Klux Klan Act that effectively outlawed the organization. It meant, likewise, voting for Andrew Jackson's 1868 impeachment, yet it would be wrong to claim his voting record was predictable. The longer Reconstruction went on, the more Garfield's radical side started to cool.
And that's true in general. A lot of people often look at the 1876 election, for example, and say, oh my gosh, Reconstruction only ended because Rutherford B. Hayes made this corrupt bargain to get the White House to pull troops out. Yeah, not really, though, because by 1876, even if you look at Grant's second term from 1873 to 1877, he was having a harder and harder time accomplishing things related to Reconstruction because public opinion on Reconstruction, on federal troops in the South, on being kind of hard on the South, was turning against Reconstruction. And it became harder and harder. And so Garfield was hardly alone on that. That was the mainstream American viewpoint, was going from radical in the aftermath of the Civil War to less and less radical as time went on.
Whereas 1863 Garfield had called for the smashing of the South, the Garfield of Reconstruction was more cautious, advocating reconciliation over confrontation. For some colleagues, this was an infuriating sign that there was nothing to him, that his opinions would just blow in the wind like a field of ripe corn. To which Garfield's defenders could reply with his clear commitment to America's newly enfranchised black citizens, to the speeches he made, passionately condemning the waves of lynching that had broken out. Sadly, though, it's here that we come to another great contradiction in the story of James A. Garfield. In the long run, his actions may have only made the problems facing black Southerners that much worse. The trigger point was the 1876 election between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden. Now, because we perhaps foolishly set about conveying the presidents in mostly reverse order, you'll have to wait until our Hayes video to get the real lowdown on what happened. But the simple version is that the results were unbelievably close. While the Democrats won the popular vote by 3 points, the Electoral College was gridlocked. With 185 electoral votes needed to win, Tilden had 184, while Hayes had 165. That left 20 electoral votes still in play, just enough to decide the competition. In the Deep South, 3 states were each reporting 2 sets of electors, one for Hayes and one for Tilden, which meant Congress now needed to figure out who was going to be president. In the electoral commission that followed, Garfield served as one of the Republicans investigating the outcome. We say investigating in air quotes here because, when the time came, all the Republicans on the committee voted on party lines to award Hayes the 20 disputed electors.
Yeah, so I think the committee was 8-7, with 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats, because that's typically how committees go in Congress. Whatever party has the majority in Congress, the committees are built that way with more members for the majority party. And so that was how this committee went. And so it was 8-7, 8-7, 8-7. So the Republicans all voted for Hayes and the Democrats all voted for Tilden. And so all 3 states' electoral votes went to Hayes. But again, I think it's overstating it to say it would have been a whole lot different had Tilden become president than Hayes.
This took him to 185, the exact number needed to claim victory and become president. It again opened the door to a bargain with the devil. In the tense atmosphere following Hayes' victory, Republicans cut a backroom deal with Tilden and the Democrats. If Democrats went along with President Hayes, the North would pull all of its troops out of the South. Reconstruction would be over.
But again, what would Tilden have done? Tilden would have done the same thing. So I think this whole corrupt deal thing is really overblown.
And all of the South's black citizens would be left at the mercy of their former overlords. It was the beginning of a near century of oppression, of civil rights denied, and deeply racial violence. In short, it was everything Garfield had made all those fine speeches arguing against. And yet, when push came to shove, it had been his actions that had indirectly helped usher in Jim Crow.
I disagree with that.
Over the 17 years he sat in the House, Garfield witnessed all sorts of political arguments come and go over silver-backed money, over the legality of labor unions. But there was one constant from start to finish: corruption. This was the great era of patronage, when a key point of becoming a representative was not to just shove your own snout into the trough, but also those of everyone who ever did you a political favor.
Patronage, basically, we've talked about this before, I won't get too deeply into it, but basically it's called the spoils system. In other words, to the victor go the spoils. You get power and you give all your friends powerful positions or positions where they can make a lot of money. And the post-war years here, this time, 1870s, 1880s, especially after the corruption of the Grant administration, you've got a real laser focus on dealing with the patronage and the corruption system.
The federal government had no concept of meritocracy, no exams that needed to be taken to fill non-political posts beyond one we might call advanced kissing. The result was a system so entrenched, so corrupt, that pretty much everyone got ensnared in it. It would take superhuman character to resist. And James A. Garfield was no Superman. Like a certain fat orange cat left alone with John's dinner, Garfield couldn't help but snaffle a slice of that delicious lasagna. Only in reality, John was the taxpayer, and his lasagna was the federal budget. Over the years, the future president was caught taking money to help a construction company avoid federal oversight, handing out a corrupt paving contract, and voting to give himself a retroactive raise. Not that it hurt his career prospects. In this great swampy era, corruption was less of a hindrance than getting on the wrong side of powerful people, and Garfield was a natural at making people at the top like him. You can see this from the way he balanced between the 2 major Republican factions of his era: the stalwarts who organized under Ulysses S. Grant and the slightly more reformist half-breeds under James G. Blaine. Able to tiptoe between both camps, by 1880, Garfield was one of the few people the entire party could do business with, which may explain the upset that happened at the party convention that year. As the GOP gathered to nominate its presidential candidate, a deadlock emerged between stalwarts trying to renominate former President Grant and half-breeds pumping for James G. Blaine.
And this actually was kind of how you get Abraham Lincoln in 1860. You know, Abraham Lincoln in 1860 does not go in as the favorite for the nomination, but he's kind of everybody's second choice. You know, basically what you have is a situation where you have people, in this case, people who are diehard for Grant who will never go for Blaine, people who are for Blaine who will never go for Grant, and they're deadlocked because neither one's got enough votes. So it's like, well, I can't vote for him. Well, I can't vote for him. Well, what about Garfield? Okay, we can support Garfield. So it kind of becomes everybody's second choice. This happened many times.
Now, this wasn't meant to be a problem. Going in, there had already been a compromise candidate lined up in the form of Treasury Secretary John Sherman. Yet it wouldn't be Sherman who wound up getting the nomination. On the 34th ballot, 16 votes were
Also
suddenly
from
put
Ohio,
forward
John
for
Sherman.
Garfield. One ballot later, the number had jumped to 50. Sensing a chance to screw over the stalwarts, the half-breeds leapt on Garfield's bandwagon. John Sherman's supporters followed them. By the end of ballot 36, the results were clear. Ulysses S. Grant's comeback had failed. James A. Garfield would be the Republican nominee.
So you might be wondering, well, how's this even possible? Why did they take 36 ballots at the convention? This is not a time when there was voting, like, by the entire populace on nominations like we have today, where we have a whole primary process. That happened largely outside of the ballot box here. It basically was the party faithful. It's the people who are the bigwigs in the party who are gathering at the convention to make these decisions. They have since delegated such authority to people who nominate. It could still theoretically happen if you go into a convention and nobody's got the votes. You could have this kind of wheeling and dealing still happen.
To call this a setback for the stalwarts would be a bit of an understatement. They couldn't have been more shocked if Garfield had personally given Grant an atomic wedgie. Sadly, for the new nominee, though, even with this setback, the stalwarts were still powerful. Powerful enough to get their own man on the ticket, Chester A. Arthur. A man who'd come up under the tutelage of corruption superstar and all-round Machiavellian mischief-maker Senator Roscoe Conkling, Arthur was everything the half-breeds hated. It was also essential to Garfield having a cat-in-hell's chance of winning in November.
So this is all part of the... at this time, there's no federal income tax. There's no real big way for the federal government to get income. Its primary means of income is through tariffs, things like that. And a lot of that money that's coming into the federal government, a big chunk of the federal government's revenue is coming in through the New York Customs House. It's coming in through imports through New York City. And the New York Tammany Hall, this kind of political machine that controlled that, had just a ridiculous amount of power. And Arthur is kind of a product of that.
The stalwarts weren't stupid. The man they'd forced onto the VP ticket was from Conkling's power base of New York. And with 35 electoral votes up for grab, New York was a state Garfield could not afford to lose. Hence the meeting the new nominee took there on August the 5th. A meeting where Garfield promised the stalwarts he wouldn't forget them when it came to handing out posts. Although Conkling himself wasn't there, the meeting had his fingerprints all over it, which meant he was now more than happy to use New York's political machine to help Garfield win. On November the 2nd, 1880, Garfield went up against Democrat Winfield S. Hancock in a nail-biter.
Did he just say Winfield S. Hancock? Winfield Scott Hancock. Hancock the Superb. He of Gettysburg fame and things like that. Yeah, probably one of the best candidates that the Democrats were able to field for a good 30 years or so. And he ran up against that New York political machine and still almost won the election.
Garfield netted the narrowest popular vote to win on record, carrying the day by less than 0.1%. But with New York's 35 electoral votes in the bag, the Electoral College was his. Having helped the now president-elect over the line, the stalwarts and Conkling could breathe easy, certain the new guy wouldn't rock the corruption boat.
And one thing that hasn't gotten mentioned here is that at this point, Garfield is a senator-elect as well. This is the time before the direct election of senators, and so state legislature would be responsible for choosing the senator. And the state legislature of Ohio had actually elected Garfield to be a new senator from Ohio. So had he lost the presidential election in 1881, he would have become a U.S. senator from Ohio.
Little did they know that Garfield was already forming his own plans that wouldn't just end Conklin's career, but would bring the whole rotten edifice of the patronage system tumbling down. When telling the story of Garfield's presidency, people normally just focus on the juicy assassination part rather than the 100 days leading up to it. Certainly that's understandable. After all, Garfield, unique among assassinated presidents, had no major event he oversaw before dying. No Civil War, no Cuban Missile Crisis, no Spanish-American War. Yeah. Yet, it's also only half the story, because to truly understand the long impact of Garfield's short presidency, you have to first look at the big fight that characterized his administration. The fight against corruption. Although Garfield had come up within the patronage system, he seems to have been deeply uneasy with it.
And this says a lot about the guy. It shows his pragmatism and understanding that he needed that system to get elected, but it also shows his character and understanding that that system needed to be taken down.
1880, it was clear the lack of a dedicated civil service class appointed on merit was holding America back, that handing powerful posts to those who'd done you political favors was a shortcut to dysfunctional government. Already the new president was being hounded by people who'd worked his campaign begging for jobs, like the widow who kept writing to him demanding the ambassadorship to Vienna in return for a pro-Garfield speech he'd made. Much better, the new president felt, to simply sweep it all away. The only problem being that he'd have to get past Senator Roscoe Conkling.
And the problem is that one of those crazy people demanding an appointment without any real deserving of one is going to be the very guy who's going to come along and kill him. I did a whole video on the story of Charles Guiteau. I'll put a link at the end as well as down in the description if you want to see the video reaction that I did about the story of the guy who assassinated Garfield.
As the beating heart of corruption in US politics, Conklin stood to lose money and authority if Garfield's reforms went through. Moreover, he felt that it helped steer New York into Garfield's camp during the election. Rather than reform the patronage system, the president should be using it to appoint whoever the hell Conklin wanted. It was this power struggle that took up most of Garfield's time in office, a period in which the president tried to push through reforms while Conklin and the stalwarts tried to block them. Luckily, Garfield lived just long enough to see himself victorious. The showdown came when the president went over Conklin's head to appoint the new collector of the Port of Authority, Chester A. Arthur's old job. Incensed, Conklin resigned from the Senate in protest. It was a trick.
Think about that for just a second. A United States senator resigned from the Senate in protest because the president did not appoint his guy to a influential big money post, the Port of New York, Chester Arthur's old job. That shows you how entrenched this was. That shows you what a big deal this was. And Conkling thought that resigning in protest would be his way of getting people on his side. He would get reappointed, or he would run for president, or something would happen, and he would win in the end.
Tricky move. In those days, senators were selected by their state rather than by popular vote. Conklin knew that New York would re-elect him, at which point he could claim a renewed mandate to fight Garfield. But the one-time Machiavellian had miscalculated. New York could see the wind was blowing in Garfield's direction. After 14 years defining American politics, Roscoe Conklin was now toast. It was the beginning of the ends of the patronage system, the first step towards an overhaul that would forever end the concept of doling out jobs to talentless supporters. Unfortunately, this would make one untalented Garfield supporter very unhappy. Back in the fall of 1880, Chester J. Guiteau had gotten on stage in New York.
He just said Chester J. Guiteau. I understand that he's not doing the research on this stuff himself. He's just reading a script. But man, don't they catch this stuff in editing and fix it?
For a small crowd and made a barely literate speech in support of James Garfield's candidacy. Although the event was sanctioned by the Republican Party, turnout was abysmal. Barely anyone saw the talk, and those that did simply clapped politely while side-eyeing each other and wondering, is this guy for real? But that's not how Guiteau remembered it. In his eyes, his speech had been the thing that saved Garfield's campaign. The sprinkling of magic that had boosted him to victory in New York, and thus to victory in the Electoral College. Being a reasonable man, Guiteau felt this required a reward. For months now, he'd been writing to Garfield asking for the ambassadorship to Vienna. If that wasn't available, then he was willing to take a consulship to Paris. He was still under the delusion that his reward was coming when news broke of Conckling's fall, of Garfield's plan to overhaul the patronage system. Not long after, Guiteau turned up at the White House in person and was told firmly to give up on the ambassadorship. And just like that, this strange, sick man's mind snapped. If Garfield was indeed threatening to reform the system, then Guiteau needed a stalwart to take over in the Oval Office as soon as possible. And with Chester A. Arthur, the VP, that meant only one thing. Charles Guiteau was going to have to kill the president.
I am a stalwart and Arthur is president. That's what he said.
It's a strange piece of dramatic irony that around the same time Guiteau was buying a gun and stalking the president, Garfield was writing, "Assassination can no more be guarded against than death by lightning, and it is not best to worry about either." Which is a fine little phrase, but on the other hand, dude, you are literally the president, my guy. Guarding against assassination comes with the territory, yeah? But then, no one in 1880s America believed it necessary. Although the first presidential assassination
think about this. You have a period of time here in 36 years. 3 U.S. presidents are assassinated. Lincoln in 1865, Garfield in 1881, and then McKinley in 1901. 36 years, 3. And it wasn't just in the U.S. Assassinations were happening. There were a lot of them happening in Europe, in places like Russia and in Austria. And this was a time of a lot of this kind of thing happening.
In place when John Wilkes Booth had shot Abraham Lincoln, everyone agreed it was just one of those awful things that happens in war. That the defeat of the Confederacy had created special circumstances that would never be repeated. After all, presidents aren't like some European monarch, they're elected. And who would possibly want to kill a leader elected by their people? So it was that on July the 2nd, 1881, President Garfield went to catch a train surrounded not by bodyguards, but with only his unarmed friend, James G. Blaine, for company. It was a fine day, and while he was traveling for sad reasons to visit his...
I wouldn't say only, because among others, Secretary of War Robert Todd Lincoln was there as well. He was in that entourage. There were more than just the two of them.
His little wife, Garfield, was in a fine mood. That morning, he'd playfully wrestled with his sons, then done headstands for their amusement while singing Gilbert and Sullivan songs. He couldn't wait to get out of Washington. After his bruising fight with Conklin, he'd finally get a chance to relax. Except, of course, Garfield would never leave the capital. At 9:20 a.m., Garfield was in the station, waiting for his train, when Charles Guiteau stepped up behind him.
Again, maybe I'm quibbling over words here, but he did leave the capital, because he didn't die in Washington.
There were 2 sharp cracks. Garfield was
Not right
to
away,
shout,
anyway.
"My God, what is this?" And then the president was on the floor, a bullet wound in his back, a pool of blood collecting around him. Amazingly, the bullet had missed his vital organs. If Garfield received an identical wound just a few years later, he would have survived.
Yeah.
But 1881 was still too early. Too early for American doctors to have learned an important lesson, that sticking unsterilized equipment into a gaping wound is a really, really good way to kill someone from it.
And there were doctors who knew better. The quack that was overseeing his medical care was the issue. Had there been other doctors in charge, may have been a different outcome.
Infection. And that's exactly what happened to Garfield. Under the care of the improbably named Dr. Willard Bliss, and yes, his first name and title were both Doctor, the president was subject to horrific medical malpractice. Convinced the bullet needed to be removed, Bliss repeatedly stuck his unsterilized fingers into the wound until, over the course of several weeks, the bullet hole became a foul-smelling swamp of pus. The most galling part, Joseph Lister had already made his world-changing discoveries on the importance of sterilization. In Europe, doctors now routinely washed their hands, but not in America. Instead, Bliss just kept on letting more and more dirt and bacteria into the festering hole. At the same time, he cut the injured Garfield's food intake to almost zero and began purging him, pumping the president with quinine, and he vomited his stomach dry. By these methods, the good doctor did what Guiteau's badly aimed bullet had failed to do. James A. Garfield died in awful pain on September the 19th, 1881, aged only 49. At the end, his body was riddled with infection. His stout 201-pound frame had been reduced to a mere 130 pounds. It said that his last words were a near incoherent plea for pain relief. At the time of his death, Garfield had been president for only 200 days, still the second shortest tenure in history. While his assassination shook the country, it seemed he would leave no legacy behind. That with Chester A. Arthur's ascension to the presidency, Charles Guiteau's goals would be fulfilled. Only that's not quite how things worked out. In the bleak aftermath of Garfield's death, President Arthur did something he'd have found impossible only months before. He pushed through an act in Garfield's name, reforming the civil service.
The very guy, Conkling's guy, ends up pushing through civil service reform, much to Chester Arthur's credit. He was a product of a system that he helped destroy.
And killing off the patronage system. In doing so, he fulfilled the dead man's unlikely dream of draining the Washington swamp. Likewise, Garfield's death also prompted a much-delayed medical revolution. Faced with high-profile evidence that Joseph Lister's theories were right, American doctors finally adopted the practice of washing their hands and sterilizing instruments. Doubtless this saved thousands of lives every year. Not that realizing poor medical care had killed Garfield was enough to save Guiteau. Although he tried to argue at trial that the doctors were to blame, Guiteau was found guilty of murder. On the 30th of June 1882, he danced up the steps of the gallows in Washington before being hanged. He was 40. Today, President Garfield is barely remembered, known only for getting assassinated and sharing his name with a cartoon cat. If he's known at all, that is. In many ways, this is perhaps the true tragedy of his tale. Here was a self-made man who came from nothing, who was born into biting poverty, and through sheer talent and determination rose to become the most powerful person in the country. He then used that position to try his damnedest to fight corruption that had been entrenched for decades. With such a short tenure, it's perhaps inevitable that history would forget James A. Garfield, but hopefully this video has shown that it shouldn't be this way. That if he can't be remembered as a great president, then we can, at least, perhaps remember Garfield as the greatest president we never truly had.
Yeah. One of my greatest what ifs, and will be to the day I die, what might have happened if Garfield had lived. Super intelligent, was headed in the right direction with some things. But let me know your thoughts. What do you think about all this? Check out my other video. I'll throw up a link to that one about his assassination. We'll see you again real soon. Thanks for watching.